So it seems like this over 3 hour video is just about done. So I can't see how this could be anything but my last comment on this film. Um, it went through a few more stories, and it's kind of easier to see that my suspicions about this coming from a religious perspective are noted accurate. And it's funny actually because he states at the very beginning, the first thing he says at the beginning of the film is that he has no ideological inclinations. I think that that's not borne out by what I see in the film. Um, when he gets to the Noah story, instead of talking about it or evidence for it or against it, he spends the time arguing that the Jewish version is more reliable than the Sumerian version. That section of this film is not. It doesn't have anything to do with the idea of ancient aliens. It's purely an argument for the superiority of the Jewish texts. Um, Essentially, it's a hit job on the Sumerian texts, and the only real reason that one could come up with to put that into this film would be to suggest that the Jewish scriptures have a higher level of validity and credibility than the sources that are certainly at least very similar to them. Um, so that kind of made that part clear. Sometimes, you don't need a lot of evidence to expose a lie. You just need, an admission in the proper place, and that's what that section really functioned as. It made it clear that this person is actually operating from a Judeo-Christian perspective, and that's what his aim here appears to be. Um, After that, it's gone into what it's calling a Nephilim, quote unquote, section. And it acknowledges that there's stories all over the world about beings coming down from the sky and having sex with humans. But rather than try to address that or talk about it, it just changes the topic and instead talks about the question of artificial insemination. And again, I have to give it a little bit of slack here because it's claiming to debunk a film, and the film it was the film that made the argument, so it's approaching that right. Although the reality is that artificial insemination or not artificial insemination, it doesn't really have anything to do with the fact, with the compelling part of this, which is that this is a tradition that exists across cultures that are very far apart, would have had minimal contact, um, some contact, no doubt, but minimal contact in the ancient world, um, and just the reality that it's very curious that they all have the same story. They all have the same story with the flood, and we do have enough, um, you know, uh, paleoclimatological records to conclude that that probably did happen. Um, this video focuses on the idea of there being 8 people on the Ark. Again, as I pointed out before on the flood myth video, we don't really need to go looking for an Ark, and we don't really need to start worrying about how many people were on the Ark. We just need to recognize that, okay, there's a story about a huge flood, and look, there's all this evidence that suggests that a huge flood happened. Put it together, maybe that has something to do with one another. And similarly with this story, you don't really need to start talking about, did the aliens have sex with the humans? It's very hard to see how it is that they could have produced offspring. I mean, we're not even talking about. What is the common ancestor between humans and aliens? What basis would you have to conclude um, any means of actually reproducing. What basis would you have to even conclude that sexual um, uh, relations were even possible? Okay, but it's the idea that seems, um, you know, stable across all these cultures of something coming down from the sky and taking interest in the fertile half of our species, in some context or another. Um, Again, it, we need to we need to figure out the question of how they would have sex before we can answer the question of if they had sex. And I don't even think that we need to even contemplate the idea of there being offspring. But stories could easily develop up and build themselves up beyond that. The documentary doesn't go into that again. It just changes the topic and it wants to talk about whether the texts are consistent with the idea of artificial insemination. And they're talking about the story of Lamech. Maybe they'll bring up the story of Mary, and how she was impregnated by God soon enough. The Immaculate Conception. That's the idea that they're going around Immaculate Conceptions. Maybe they're talking about this instead, because the Mary story is a little bit too sacrilegious. I don't know. But it's this idea that they're going towards. Again, I don't. I can understand an Immaculate Conception as a meme, going back to Egyptian, and perhaps even earlier mythology. It's an idea of magic, that's not convincing to me one way or the other. What's interesting to me is just the story of beings coming from the sky, and how cross-referenced that is. Something else I want to point out, though, is that in this segment, they say that the fact that the story is in multiple different sources, is a good reason, to suggest that maybe there's something to it. Whereas, of course, I pointed out in the other section, they pointed out that the fact that the story was in all of these different places suggested that um, that was a reason you should not take it seriously. So, this is the kind of thing that they go after this film for all the time. You made one argument one way, and then you made another argument the other way. They're doing the same thing. Um, that they're not providing consistency themselves. But again, I really haven't seen much of anything. I watched all 3 hours of this over, I don't know, it's been a week, something like that, and I didn't get a single really useful argument out of it. Or maybe if you want to go back and watch all the rambling I've done on it, if you can pull something out that I forgot, then great. But I don't. Right now I can't think of anything that I pulled out of this that's really very useful. And I'm kind of stepping away from this with the conclusion that this is um, a traditional Jewish or religious or Christian person of religious persuasion. Um, Perhaps they're even denying it to themselves. Um, one can be religious and not realize it, right? It's probably a lot more common than you would actually think. This idea of, claiming. I saw the very end of that go out, so I'm pretty sure that the last thing I said was claiming to be a rational person, and having your intellectual facilities overpower um, any kind of mythological feelings that you have, whether arrived at early or late in life, but ultimately not being able to let your critical reasoning overpower what it is that you're feeling. Or it just being sort of like deep set inside of your psyche or something like that, right? And whether it's actually that, or this is more of a conscious hit job is unclear. But it does seem to me that the person that made this video is unable to come to terms with these other ideas. I mean, like I said, the physical, the archaeological stuff, the architectural stuff was nonsense to begin with. It's the mythological aspect that's actually of interest, and of worth serious discussion. And from what I can see here, what I'm pulling out of this video is that this is somebody that would prefer to accept the faith of their texts, whether consciously or subconsciously, rather than the idea of speculating upon naturalistic explanations for them, or perhaps has even come to the conclusion that if these texts are to be taken seriously at all, then it should be in the traditional, religious mythological aspect rather than in a naturalistic context. I wish I got more out of this than that. Maybe something will come up in my watch later that actually ties some things together a little bit better. But it's just a bunch of straw men and a bunch of diversions. Sorry, that's all I got from that.